Okay, good morning, everyone. We're here to talk about the Bipartisan Global Fragility Act. It was adopted in December 2019. It signals a really important new willingness in Congress to provide the State Department and USAID with the funding, flexible funding, and a multi-year mandate to reduce and prevent violence and conflict. The GFA also offers an unprecedented opportunity to test and learn from new approaches to prevent conflict, cement congressional support for strategies to reduce violence, build stability in conflict-affected countries and regions. So this morning, let me introduce myself. I'm Liz Hume. I'm the Vice President of the Alliance for Peace Building, and thank you so much for coming to PeaceCon. This is, of course, one of my favorite topics, the Global Fragility Act, and I'm sure you've heard myself and Kareem and Richmond talk about the GFA, but we also have some other guests for you today that you might not have heard from on this topic. So first, let me start off and introduce Kareem Graf. She's a senior advisor at USAID, where her work focuses on long-term strategies and policies to prevent the outbreak or escalation of conflict in fragile states. She was a senior policy advisor on the Task Force on Violent Extremism in Fragile States. Before that, she was a deputy assistant administrator for the Africa Bureau at USAID. She served at the NSC, and she was also a senior advisor to the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations. Kareem has been working on the GFA years now, right, Kareem? We've been working on it together, and she's been our critical colleague from USIP. Richmond Blake is extraordinaire, Richmond Blake. He's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Mercy Corps, and he has, in the last few years, been the driving force of the GFA coalition and pushing the Global Fragility Act forward. He came from the State Department prior to Mercy Corps, and he has been one of my most trusted colleagues on this work, and I'm so thankful for Kareem and Richmond. But since you've probably heard from us a lot, and maybe getting a little sick and tired of hearing on us from the Global Fragility Act, I want to make sure we're really excited that we have a couple of other people to give you another take on it. Mark Iozzi, he's the Deputy Chief Counsel in the U.S. House of Representatives from the Foreign Affairs Committee. Since 2014, Mark has been working in the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House. There's probably no one who knows these issues better and has been such an incredible colleague to us and has been such a driving force on this. Megan Gallagher, she's a professional staff member on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. She's served in this position since 2017, and before that was in the Senate. And again, Megan has been phenomenal at working through this bipartisan legislation and just been a tremendous colleague. And none of this would have happened without these two individuals and Representative McCall and Representative Engel. And so we are beyond thankful for their assistance and their incredible work. Jonathan Marley is a policy analyst at the OECD, where he leads the state's fragility team. And prior to that, he's worked on security sector reform for the Geneva Center for Security and Governance. He's been all over, from Gambia to Chad to Kosovo to Lebanon. And the OECD just put out in September a huge fragility report. And one of the key aspects that we don't talk enough about on the GFA is that the U.S. can't do it alone. And so that's why we wanted Jonathan here to talk about it from another perspective and how important multilateralism is and other donors. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Richmond just to make sure to get us on the right page. I know many of you out there know a lot about the Global Fragility Act, but I want Richmond to get us up to speed right now.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Liz, for organizing this panel and for being such a wonderful partner in leading the Global Fragility Act Coalition. My name is Richmond Blake, and I'm the Director of Policy at Mercy Corps. And I just want to remind everyone before we jump into the substance of this conversation about where we were last year when we had the annual PeaceCon event. At that point, the Global Fragility Act was still pending legislation. It was an aspiration and something that we were all united behind. And a few months after last year's PeaceCon, it was enacted into law. And that has been such an incredible opportunity for our community. I just want to acknowledge how much work went into making that happen. So many of you watching now and your organizations put so much force and time behind the Congressional Advocacy component. And of course, to our colleagues on the Hill, I'm so delighted that Mark and Megan can be here because they did so much advocacy behind the scenes that we weren't always able to see, but without which the law would not have been enacted. So a huge thank you to them as well. I want to start today's conversation by first grounding us and reminding everyone what the Global Fragility Act says and doesn't include. And I think that's important so that our conversation can be factual. And so first, I just want to point out and remind everyone what the statement of policy of the Global Fragility Act says. It is a policy of the United States government to stabilize conflict-affected areas and prevent violence and fragility globally. And then it provides three main efforts to support that. The first is by strengthening coordination internally within the US government. The second is by strengthening and enhancing global coordination through multilateral engagement. And the third is enhancing the effectiveness of US foreign assistance programs and activities. The Global Fragility Act also has three main requirements. The first, and the foundational piece, is the development of a global fragility strategy. The law requests that the US government provide this strategy within 270 days of enactment, or by September 15th of 2020. And this strategy is to be developed in coordination amongst the national security or foreign affairs agencies. The law does enumerate a specific set of issues that are to be addressed in the strategy. Things like identification of specific objectives and multi-sectoral approaches, how to engage with local actors, and a set of potential programmatic areas of focus. Everything from good governance and the rule of law, justice sector reform, civilian security, and inclusive dialogues in conflict resolution. Within the Global Fragility Strategy, the law asks the US government to select no fewer than 5 priority countries where this strategy will be piloted over a 10-year period. The law sets out clear criteria for the selection of those countries, including the US national interest, indicators of violence or fragility, including the OECD States of Fragility report, and I'm so glad Jonathan could be here to talk about that. Levels of vulnerability in countries, including things like environmental degradation, food insecurity, and human displacement. And one of the criteria is also a commitment of the national and subnational governments within those priority countries to partnering with the US government to deliver this strategy. The second component that the law requires is that within 1 year of enactment, so by December 19th of this year, the US government is to develop country-specific plans for each of the priority countries. These country-specific plans should include a baseline analysis for each country, descriptions and timelines of the goals and objectives, and interagency plans for delivering the foreign assistance and diplomatic activities articulated in the Global Fragility Strategy. And the third requirement, the third component of the law, are biennial reports. every other year or within 2 years of enactment of the Global Fragility Act. So by December 19th of 2022, the President shall provide to Congress a biennial report on the status of the Global Fragility Act implementation and progress in each of the priority countries. Those are the three components of the law, the three requirements that are due to Congress. So where are we now? In May of this year, the Global Fragility Act Coalition had the great opportunity to partner with the U.S. Institute of Peace in hosting a civil society consultation event. U.S. government representatives attended that event where civil society experts discussed Global Fragility Act implementation and the development of the Global Fragility Strategy. Another important point of reference is that on September 4th of this year, President Trump delegated a portion of the Global Fragility Act authorities provided to him by Congress to the Secretary of State. Specifically, that executive order transferred to the Secretary of State the authorities under Sections 504A and C of the Global Fragility Act, which is development of the Global Fragility Strategy and the report due to Congress. Shortly after that executive order was issued, on September 15th of this year, the State Department, on behalf of the entire US government, provided a report to Congress pursuant to Section 504C of the Global Fragility Act. And that report reaffirmed many of the goals contained in the law and highlighted four key areas of focus: prevention, stabilization, burden sharing or multilateral engagement, and management or internal coordination. That report did not include all of the components required by law. For example, although the report outlined that the process that the US government would take to select the priority countries, the report did not include or name each of those priority countries. We now understand that the US government is working on finalizing the Global Fragility Strategy and that it will be released in the coming months. And I think it is fair to say that we can assume that given that the Global Fragility Strategy is still pending, the 10-year country-specific plans will likely not be delivered by December 19th of this year as called for in the law. And the last thing I want to note in terms of the core components of the Global Fragility Act is how it would be funded. How will these programs be supported? The Global Fragility Act authorized three funds: the Prevention and Stabilization Fund, the Complex Crises Fund, and the Multi-Donor Global Fragility Fund. When the Global Fragility Act passed, it not only authorized these funds, it appropriated to two of the three. It appropriated $30 million to the Complex Crises Fund and $200 million to the Prevention and Stabilization Fund. So this is an overview of what the Global Fragility Act is and what it contains. And later in the discussion, I would be happy to talk to you about where the Global Fragility Act Coalition would like to see it go. Thanks, Liz.
So thank you so much, Richmond, for that really comprehensive overview. And I know it can be a little daunting. So we'll talk a little bit more about where we want to see it go. But at least now we're sort of all on the same page to understand where we are at this moment in time with the GFA. So I want to start off and talk to Megan and Mark. I'd like you guys to, spend spend some time to tell us really what is the intent? What was the intent behind the GFA? Why is it so important? But why did it take so long for us to get here at this point in time? And also, how did this bipartisan piece of legislation come out in a time when, the U.S. is increasingly, it's hard to have a bipartisan piece of legislation come out. So if you can tell us a little bit about those pieces, and also, what do you see as the challenges to make sure that we ensure successful implementation? So I'm going to let you guys take it from here. And I know everybody's pretty interested to hear from Congress. our Congress officials. Take it.
Why don't I can go ahead and start and just give a few minutes. Maybe I'll tell the really brief story about how this bill became a law and sort of what Congress was, at least from Chairman Ngo and my perspective, what we were trying to achieve here, why we were interested in this, and then I'll maybe pause there and turn it over to Meg before we get into the sort of next steps and what Congress sees for this going forward. This bill started years ago on one of those, from my perspective, on the Hill. And I think it's one of these like collaborative efforts that started in a lot of different places at once and then came together, and maybe, each person, people on this call and people who have contributed, who have, moved on even over these years, everyone sees sort of their chunk in this. But from my perspective, it started years ago as both a perception of opportunities and frustrations that were coming out of briefings here on the Hill and travel that we were taking overseas, where you see, in between a mix of, exceptional staff members doing really great programming, you see these sort of disconnects and gaps in the lessons that are being learned from years of conflict prevention, conflict stabilization, and disconnects between those lessons and the programming that's actually taking place on the ground. And, opportunities that professionals across the interagency and from multilateral efforts, opportunities that they see, but just due to a variety of bureaucratic problems, bureaucratic inertia, and sort of lack of political engagement in the right places, just those lessons not being applied to update our programming and to really get the most value out of the engagement that we are putting into these places. And so there was this clear perception that there was an opportunity to do better and gaps in our programming. And that sort of interest from Congress's part met sort of a proposal from advocates to engage in what was initially pitched to me as PEPFAR for global peace. This huge effort to reshape the way the U.S. government engages, to prioritize conflict prevention and violence prevention specifically. And then that seemed like a really great opportunity to match up concrete policy objectives with sort of this opportunity for a huge new vision for U.S. government engagement. So it's great to have like this really promising idea, but then how do you turn that into legal text? That's the next several years. We're trying to build a coalition around specifically what were we trying to achieve. And this, what we thought was this idea that there were serious gaps in planning and prioritization and coordination across the interagency, across the various departments and agencies from the U.S. government that are working on this, and across our partners and allies in multilateral spaces. And then a real gap in first just monitoring and evaluation of what was working, especially when we got out of sort of some of the humanitarian issues that were easier to measure and into sort of violence prevention more generally, and countering violent extremism and some of the other efforts that dovetail with our engagement in conflicts and fragile states. There was just a real lack of implementing monitoring and evaluation, and then particularly updating programming on an iterative basis and adapting the programming in response to that monitoring and evaluation. So we focused on trying to solve those problems through this legislation and realized that we had a bill that had both a humanitarian component, a national security component, and an opportunity just to make U.S. government programming more effective and efficient, better able to achieve the outcomes that the U.S. government was setting out to achieve. And those issues together are something that have huge bipartisan appeal. And I think Meg can talk about this from her perspective and how she came in. But I think from the start, this was something that had bipartisan interest in Congress and looked like it therefore had an opportunity to get done. That said, legislating takes a long time. And I think the heart of that problem is that diplomacy and foreign assistance don't have a clear vehicle that becomes law every year from an authorizing perspective. So it's really hard to figure out, even though the chairman and ranking member of the Committee of Jurisdiction in the House, with strong bipartisan interest from key stakeholders in the Senate, all wanted to get something done, there wasn't a clear path to get it done. We can pass something when the chair and ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee co-sponsor legislation, they can pass it out of the House almost immediately. But that doesn't mean that it's going to get floor time in the Senate and that 100% of the senators are going to give it unanimous consent to pass. So we needed a piece of a vehicle to get it done, even though we had had this piece of legislation that had such buy-in. And finally, we found that almost a year ago, over a weekend, probably this past weekend, a year ago, we saw an opportunity to get this on the appropriations vehicle that was moving. It was frantic negotiations late into the night over a weekend. And finally, we got agreement after some last minute rewriting, and the bill became law. And I think I'll leave it there to give Meg a chance to talk about it from her perspective.
Thanks, Mark. That was a good intro, and I definitely remember the 1 year ago, probably this weekend, of a lot of 11 p.m. emails and red line text, and a lot of cooks in the kitchen trying to get it over the finish line. I guess I'll just say, and Mark deserves all the credit in the world on this, and leading this from Chairman Ngos' seat. I jumped into the Global Fragility Act when I started working for Ranking Member McCall 2 years ago, and obviously the effort had been underway and earned a lot of bipartisan support and a lot of hard work from many stakeholders to kind of get this train moving. So I was excited to jump into the effort 2 years ago. And I think as you talk about the bipartisan coalition, certainly from my boss's perspective as the former chairman of Homeland Security, he really latched on to that national security element of it. And when you talk about, preventing military intervention and preventing, rising extremist threats in poorly governed spaces, et cetera, and talking about how to do stabilization better and ultimately save lives in the process, I think that was something that aspect of it really resonated with him. And I think a lot of other members on the Republican side of the aisle and Democratic side of the aisle, there was a facet, a component of this bill that you could latch onto from many different perspectives, right? There's a humanitarian imperative. It's, global peace, but also it's, as Mark said, good governance and effective use of programming. And so much had been done on the stabilization front over the last 2 decades with, often little to show for it. And so how to do this better and make the case that these are dollars that are being spent. We can just do a better job of coordinating and working together. For me, when it kind of all clicked together, as Mark and I were on a trip, I think in 2018, we were in Niger, and it was kind of when you see firsthand the 3 Ds that everyone talks about, right? Of how hard it can be to coordinate, even on the field level, right? When we talk in Washington at high level strategy, having that also come down to the field level and that practical coordination, what a challenge it can be, and sometimes that conflict of interests. So for me, that was kind of when it all clicked. And I think, the broad advocacy coalition, raising awareness and honestly pounding the pavement to different offices, that's what built that bipartisan coalition. For thinking through, maybe I'll pivot to next steps of what happens after this. When this got signed into law last year, we had no idea that we'd be staring in the face of a global pandemic and a massive destabilizing force. And so, it's a new challenge, but I think it's something that the Global Fragility Act has to think through about how do you use this coordinating strategy, but to think through the impacts of COVID-19, and that's going to look different in different places, and countries that we thought were one way as a result could be in a very different place. And so, we didn't realize that this was going to be the reality of the first year of GFA, but, here we are. And I think we really built into the strategy the opportunity to pivot and monitor and fail and change. And we really want that to be an inherent part of the strategy. I guess I would also say to that, this regular consultation with Congress that we've really appreciated from the interagency working group throughout this process has been really important. While things aren't on the timeline that we had originally intended, I think the regular check-ins with different offices and stakeholders in the community has been really important. And that's something that we really intend to try to continue to make sure that implementation and the momentum behind GFA is maintained. And I think, whether that's coming to Congress and saying, hey, we're late, or, things aren't going as we expected, or coming to Congress and sharing successes. We want both and all, and regular updates to that end. So I'll kick it back over to Mark to add some points about what happens next.
So, yeah, I know that there are a number of folks who we still need to hear from, but I'll just say, sort of as far as next steps from our perspective, it is on the one hand, just really great to see this idea that's, started out as, a few lines of legislative text on the computer here to becoming this effort that's bringing together multiple countries and multilateral effort and, fostering all this engagement across the interagency. So on the one hand, that's really great. But on the other hand, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. We haven't seen this, an actual global fragility strategy yet, and certainly not one that has, in the interim update that they provided Congress, didn't have nearly the level of detail that we would need to see. I will say, in line with Meg's point, the engagement with Congress has been such that I think we're confident that things are that the executive branch is working on this hard, and we want to get it right. I think that still means that there are a lot of opportunities that need to be achieved in the next couple of months to get it right. I think one of the challenges with drafting the legislation was trying to figure out how prescriptive to be, both how prescriptive to be for ourselves in mandating the kind of ongoing engagement that Congress would have, and how prescriptive to be with the executive branch in who should be in charge of the effort and exactly how it should be rolled out. And we made a number of decisions as we were drafting, for example, not being prescriptive about the countries and not being prescriptive on the exact interagency structure. And part of that is in response to concerns from, over multiple years from legislation of, the executive branch not, being sort of resistant to being prescribed to too much. And we need to get, their buy-in and getting something passed, especially passed through the Senate right now. So we needed that. But now we have to dig in and make sure that it is actually done right. And so I think that's the fundamental challenge going forward, is how is this going to be structured to make sure that we have the right buy-in across the interagency. It was at least my initial view from the legislation that in addition to having its own funding and being a priority effort in countries, that the global fragility strategy would really be the framework that shaped all of the relevant U.S. engagement from across all of the relevant agencies in preventing conflict and stabilizing conflict-affected areas. And that requires much more buy-in from the interagency than we have right now. And so I think the key question is, how do we secure that level of buy-in, right? So, if you take a look at the Department of Defense, for example, by no means is this saying the Department of Defense needs to do more humanitarian work and more development. It's saying the opposite. But that doesn't mean that there's the role of the Department of Defense is limited to just providing logistical support in line with their funding line item. It really means, if you're going to do it right, that not security cooperation, but also partnered operations need to be informed by the global fragility strategy. And if you're looking at a time where the military footprint is changing across, for example, Africa, that changing footprint is driving the global fragility strategy, when really the strategy is supposed to be driving the footprint. And so there's a serious disconnect there. And we need to figure out how that's going to get resolved if this legislation is going to have sort of the full effect that Congress intended when it was enacted. And so I think we're watching this process really closely and trying to engage to see if we can move the ball in that direction. If not in the first strategy that comes out, then over time.
I guess I would just add one thing, if I can, to that. And I think this is a going forward conversation. As Mark said about getting, folks on board, Department of Defense and others, and, often resistant to change to really embrace this. I think one of the interesting ways that can happen is we've so appreciated the coalition led by the Alliance for Peace Building and others that's really brought in the experts on the peace building side and the development side, et cetera. Something that we have talked about in the last year is how do we start to build more stakeholders in the national security community, in the counterterrorism community, and otherwise to also join in this advocacy effort, to see their equities in this and to see the positive results that it can have. So, that's something we've been talking about going forward and would certainly welcome a conversation about from this perspective.
So thank you, Megan and Mark. Just so you guys know, it was around this time. And I know that because I had tickets to go see Hamilton with my daughter, and we were driving down to Richmond on a Sunday night. And as I was driving down there, I must have gotten 50 phone calls from Richmond as we were talking to you all. And one of the things that people don't know is that you too really held the line on prevention. You would call us and ask us, and we were like, there has to be prevention countries in there, not just stabilization. So you all were just so critical in that part. So it's funny, as you were talking, I was remembering driving down there and getting all those phone calls from Richmond. Okay, as we move forward, Kareem, you have been so instrumental. Of course, you were one of the drivers on the task force on extremism, but in the last year on implementation, AFP, Mercy Corps, the GFA Coalition worked with USIP to do the first consultation in May. And then throughout the summer, you also focused on workshops or roundtables where the government was invited and you were bringing in experts to talk about very specific issues. So can you talk why those were so important, the issues, and what were some of the findings and learnings that came out of there that are critical to ensure successful implementation of the GFA?
Sure. Thank you, Liz. And I also want to acknowledge the work that all four of the speakers that you have on screen have done. Liz, Richmond, Megan, and Mark, you have really all been at the forefront of this initiative. So thank you for your leadership. So as you suggest, Liz, we led a series of consultations this summer on what are the toughest policy challenges standing in the way of implementing the GFA. And in fact, just this morning, we released a report addressing fragility in a global pandemic based on those consultations that we held over the summer. And it offers concrete policy solutions for overcoming challenges across 6 thematic areas. And as part of the report, 17 leading peacebuilding experts offer their insights on how to overcome implementation challenges in 6 areas. So the first is, how do you implement a global fragility strategy in the current global strategic environment? With great power competition on the rise, as well, of course, as a pandemic. The second, why is local ownership of conflict prevention initiatives so important? And how can the U.S. really maximize country ownership? That's critical, but it's also not easy to do. Third, what accountability challenges confront policymakers? So how can policymakers ensure that they are both being accountable to taxpayers for their programs and investments, but also being accountable to the communities in which our programs are operating? So both upward and bottom-up accountability. Fourth, what solutions exist to overcome the age-old challenge of interagency coordination, which we've already talked about a lot? Fifth, what are the benefits of aligning U.S. efforts with those of our international partners? And how do we do that? What are some of the best ways of doing that? And finally, and I think Mark and Megan both talked about this a lot, but how should policymakers think about monitoring, evaluation, and I think critically learning? And when you have a whole of government strategy like this, as well as pilot countries, it's a lot easier said than done, I think, as well. So we chose these 6 areas because we think they're amongst the toughest challenges that policymakers face. None of these are new. They're particularly not new to anyone in this audience, but they're extremely challenging for policymakers. So I want to provide a couple of examples. We heard a lot this morning already about the need for greater alignment among agencies. We heard this morning from the opening panel about the need to align what we're doing on the humanitarian side and the development side, for example. Richmond mentioned that the GFA offers some guidance to agencies on how to structure their coordination and definitely emphasizes interagency coordination. But how do you do this? So one of my colleagues, Sarah Rose of the Center for Global Development, has a chapter in the report on integrating diplomacy and development programming. And she argues that the administration that is implementing this should take at least, at least 4 steps. There are more, but I won't go through them. The first is that she suggests that USAID, state, and other agencies that are involved agree to center the country's strategies around governance. And that they think before even going into the programming and beginning to implement about how each agency would react to developments on the governance front on the ground, and how they'll coordinate together on this. This is obviously very difficult to do, but planning ahead would be really helpful. And governance is a key piece of the GFA, and I apologize for kids in the background being very obnoxious right now. Can you guys be quiet, please? So second recommendation, state and USAID often conduct political and conflict analyses, political economy analyses. They often don't do this together. So she suggests that agencies really come together in the country implementation phase to do this and share, at minimum, share their analyses together to make sure that there's a better chance that they'll be singing from the same song sheet as they're implementing. And then she also suggests that embassies have enough staff and resources to be able to do this iteratively, because as we've already heard this morning, these analyses are going to need to be flexible and adaptable to conditions on the ground. Third, she puts a lot of emphasis on adaptive programming. And our embassies really being prepared to do this. So the coordination should really happen on the ground for this, but our embassies are going to have to push agencies to be doing the adaptive programming and to really push the envelope on this. We know USAID is moving in this direction. We know the US government is moving in this direction, but we're still quite far from being able to do this. And fourth, Sarah talks about the compact-based partnerships that are needed with international donors and with partner country governments. This is also mentioned in the GFA. But agencies will need to think also ahead of time about how to use both diplomacy and our programming to support reforms under these frameworks. And at the same time, be very conscious of supporting local reform processes and not imposing US priorities that will likely not work if we're imposing priorities from the outside. This is a very common lesson learned at this point, but actually thinking about how you do this from the get-go is important. So let me give just a second example in the next couple of minutes that I still have left. We also have a contribution from Jody Vittori of Transparency International on promoting good governance in the security sector. And she argues that our anti-corruption efforts and fighting corruption and ensuring that we don't contribute to corruption in these countries will be critical. This is in the GFA. But she argues that those efforts really need to be focused and centered on the security sector. We tend to forget the security sector in fragile environments, but it is so critical. And she suggests that that's really where we need to be putting the most emphasis, so that the security sectors don't become entrenched. And what we're doing on the civilian side with our development assistance isn't counterproductive. So I will stop there, and I invite you to take a look at the report, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I would say the bottom line is that the Global Fragility Act is extremely ambitious. We all know this, but I think it's worth worth the reminder. And there's really still a very difficult road ahead in implementing it. Regardless of how solid the global fragility strategy ends up being, regardless of whether we pick the perfect countries to focus on, this is a very, very difficult set of challenges that policymakers face in implementing. So I would encourage us to think about progress in terms of learning. Mark put a lot of emphasis on this, but I hope we can focus on learning as at least one, if not the most important outcome of this legislation over the coming years. So let me stop there.
So, Kareem, I couldn't agree with you more. Learning, but making sure, exactly going back to Mark's point, that the learning is applied, because that's really what drove this. I mean, Mark and Megan said, they were going out on CODELs to look at programs in fragile states, and all the learning that we had was not being applied. So I think you're right. It's key, but we can't wait for 10 years, once this is all finished, to then start applying these lessons learned. So, okay.
Can I say one more quick thing in response to that, Liz? So we have 3 chapters in our report on this, monitoring and evaluation and learning, but I couldn't agree more. And this needs to happen from the get-go. The planning for the monitoring and evaluation system and the focus on how are we going to learn from the next 10 years.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Kareem. And I encourage everybody to read these reports. There's I sat in on a lot of these expert roundtables, and there's just so much incredible information there. Okay, Richmond, from the NGO perspective, from the Global Fragility Coalition, what are the key things that we think are going to ensure successful implementation?
Well, first of all, just hearing Mark and Megan's comments really carries me back to the work of the GFA coalition in Congress, and is such a heartening reminder of what broad bipartisan support there was for the Global Fragility Act and for the ideas that it embodies around improving U.S. government coordination, multilateral collaboration, and aid effectiveness. But that was the first part, and now we have to demonstrate efficacy to keep that broad support. Our coalition has said all along that passing the Global Fragility Act was just the very, and we as a coalition are committed to continuing to work with five organizations. Love your idea of expanding the coalition and grow it to include an even more diverse set of stakeholders, and look forward to working together on that. But we intend to remain together and continue to advocate for effective implementation of the Global Fragility Act. I thought what would be most helpful is if I could provide some recommendations about what the coalition is thinking in terms of how the act is implemented. And first and foremost, is the Global Fragility Strategy finalized and released to the public, including the naming of the priority countries. And we recognize the delays that have come as a result of the COVID pandemic and inevitable delays that will now happen as a result of a political transition. What our request to the next administration would be is to set new self-imposed deadlines within a 3 to 6 month time frame so that they can hold themselves accountable and we as stakeholders can have a timeline by which we can expect the strategy to be released. And I think having that deadline is really important for driving bureaucratic process and getting everyone to pull in the same direction with a clear target. The second recommendation that we have is we would really like to see leadership elevated and the ownership of the Global Fragility Act elevated. I listed earlier the types of activities that are required under the Global Fragility Act in the Section 504, and it's quite diverse. It's everything from rule of law and preventing violent extremism, to human rights and governance. No one office and no one bureau within the US government has authority over all of that policy and programs. And so we recognize that a senior leader in each of the agencies, likely no lower than the level of undersecretary, will be required to really and figure out ways to bring offices and bureaus together. We would also encourage the new administration to look closely at that executive order that was issued on September 4th and think about pulling it back and really putting the White House at the center of the coordination process. Congress, in passing the Global Fragility Act, designated the president as the lead in implementing the law precisely because there were so many challenges around state agencies. Really encourage the next administration to think about appointing a White House coordinator for Global Fragility Act implementation, and then for each of the agencies to have their own task force convened by the deputy or by an undersecretary who can coordinate and lead multiple bureaus and offices. Third, we'd recommend that the next administration convene a global gathering or a summit to rally international support and to build out the multilateral component of Global Fragility Act implementation. We noted that the Senate version of the fiscal year 21 appropriations package includes funding for the multi-donor Global Fragility Fund. And a global gathering could be a wonderful opportunity for the US government to launch that fund, to announce its contribution, and to invite other governments to step forward and work with us in addressing global fragility. Fourth, we would encourage the US government to really lean into consultations with experts and with local communities. That's why it's so important that we move forward on the country selection process so that we can begin to identify not only the countries, but the local communities within where these activities will be taking place, and to launch robust consultations with those communities and the communities that will be affected by the implementation process. Fifth, we would encourage the next administration to prioritize research and learning and to ensure that the Global Fragility Act includes a comprehensive learning agenda around all GFA assistance and diplomatic activities in the priority countries. Having this type of learning agenda will be critical, not only for the reporting requirements that are embedded into the law, but also for that adaptive learning that we've heard others this morning speak about. And then finally, a really important initial act that the next administration can take is by making a statement through its first budget request. The Global Fragility Act did authorize 3 funds, and it's important that that resources be made available to implement this law, and that all 3 funds receive appropriations. Our coalition would like to see the administration request in its budget, in its initial budget proposal, that the Prevention and Stabilization Fund receive $200 million a year, as included in the original act, that the Complex Crisis Fund level of funding be restored to levels where it was as recently as 5 years ago at $50 million a year, and to provide seed funding for that multi-donor fragility fund at the level of at least $25 million in the initial year. That fund and that contribution will be critical for the US government's ability to stand up that fund and to bring together other donor governments. So Liz, those are a few of the recommendations that we have from the Global Fragility Act Coalition.
So thank you so much, Richmond. And somebody just asked a question, will these recommendations be made public? Yes, they're public. Go on AFP's website and go on the Global Fragility Act page. We have, exhaustedly talked about these recommendations. So they're all there. And if you can't find them, get in touch with myself or Richmond, and we'll be sure to send them out to you. So thank you, Richmond. That was really clear and concise in terms of those really key recommendations moving forward. All right, Jonathan, over to you. Why the U.S. We know the U.S. cannot do this alone. How do we ensure? We say it all the time. How do we ensure that we have this interconnectedness with other bilateral donors, multilateral donors, and how does the OECD look at these issues?
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to AFP for pulling together this event. It's great to be able to participate in it. I think to pick up on one of Richmond's points about the fact that there has been this delay and that they have to they're recommending this 3 to 6 month period for reflection. In some ways, I think there's an element of fortune in that, because the landscape that we're seeing for global cooperation has changed dramatically in the last 12 months. So there is a timeliness, if you like, to that I think may well play to the Act's advantage. There is, from our point of view, in terms of the work we've been doing at the OECD, looking at fragility over the last 12 months, we were already seeing a deteriorating picture before the pandemic struck. The pandemic has compounded that situation significantly. We're now looking at a situation of 3 concurrent global systemic shocks, on top of all the other regional-based shocks that we're seeing as well. And the point I'm building to here is that the scale of the challenge that's now presenting itself globally is substantially different to that which was even envisaged 12 months ago. And that poses a whole different set of questions from the point of view of international partners, multilaterals, and different agencies in terms of what this act might mean when the US carries it forward. So I guess the question becomes then, to what extent do the US choose to lead through this act? And to what extent do they drive partnerships with the potential that very clearly exists within this act? I think, in terms of capturing some of the elements of the reality that we're now faced with without stating some of the obvious points, I think what the pandemic has shown us is the systemic reality of fragility in a way, perhaps in a very visceral way now. I think we've seen how it's cascaded. We've seen how different issues of fragility relate to each other. We're seeing that systems matter now. You cannot go into a context and focus on a single issue and expect that not to have an impact on other issues and other organizations around it. So I think through the research we've conducted at the OECD, but also research we're seeing elsewhere, the World Bank, the UN, various organizations such as yourself, we have a much better understanding not just of issues of fragility, but how they come together and connect, bounce off each other, how those systems interact. And I think that's really important in terms of some of the issues that the other speakers raised. I think the other point to make about, kind of the international kind of perspective on what the act might mean is we are currently living through a very fragmented international system in terms of how we deal with issues of fragility. If you look at the situation in the Sahel, you're seeing stabilization approach, you're seeing peace building, peacekeeping, you're seeing various development strategies, often working completely independent of each other and being frustrated that they're not having the same effect. Again, a lot of the elements of the Act point towards addressing those kind of issues. But arguably the real potential is the momentum that the application of this Act could bring internationally. So there is a potential for it to drive collaboration, to build momentum for collective strategies. Certainly from the OECD's perspective, the recommendation on the humanitarian development peace nexus, which came out last February, which corresponds with so many of the issues that Kareem highlighted in terms of the report that they just released. We see that as providing, if you like, the conceptual framework and the flexibility for organizations to engage according to their competence, but also being extremely aware of what the impact of the footprint is on other organizations, where the potential is for collaboration, how to join up for better analysis, for better operational intent, and how to work better in implementation and monitoring and evaluation. So there is that element of scale, there is that potential for collaboration. I think the politics is really, really important, again, without stating the obvious, but I think what the Act promises within the US, but also what we've tried to build on with the Nexus recommendation internationally, is by bringing together the perspectives of across the pillars of the Nexus, you are bringing together a better palette of understanding to political decision makers, thereby empowering them to make better decisions. And that has happened to various different degrees, but we've also seen, that pushes back on, say, critiques relating to securitization. It pushes back on maybe one perspective within a context holding priority or sway over others. So the potential is there to strike a better balance, not just internally, but externally with other partners. So the other side of it is the potential for building momentum. And I think this comes back to the question about how and it'd be interesting to hear the views of other callers as to whether they see the Act as being a vehicle for the US to take a leadership role in this area. The diplomacy aspect plays out in a number of different ways, and I think it's something we worked on in our own papers with the State Fragility report this year. But I think Corin has captured it perfectly well. There is a capacity and a potential within diplomacy to really drive these kinds of initiatives forward, because diplomats have that mobility across the Nexus to engage with all kinds of actors, to gather that information, to condense it and present it to political decision makers to drive an agenda forward. I think as well, it's the final point I would make in terms of the kind of international view of this is that, a lot of the frameworks are already there. Only last week we had an event where we were working with the WTO, working with G7 Plus, and they were making the point, the New Deal principles are, as far as they're concerned, still providing a useful way for them to work forward. So there's a lot of structure in the system that can be scaled up, that can be maybe adapted, reinvented, supported to achieve the kind of outcomes that we're hoping to have. So I think that the big question for me is, how much leadership are they going to choose to put behind it? To pick up on Mark's point, are they willing to use it to drive partnerships? And then to see how much they're willing to align the potential of the Act with the frameworks, the multilateral frameworks that already exist. So I'll pause there and hand back to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jonathan. And that is a great question. How much leadership is the U.S. going to have? And are they going to use the GFA to really drive partnerships? I think that's a key question that will be critical to the success of the GFA. All right, so now we have lots of questions coming in. It's a pretty big session, so I'm going to try to get to as many as I can. So this is a good question, Richmond. Has the coalition been in touch with the authors of the report from the State Department? And have you pointed out its legal shortcomings? And if so, what was the rationale and the response on the shortcomings? And I know Mark and Megan, you also had discussions with the USG about this, so with the State Department, so feel free to jump in as well.
Thanks, Liz. Well, first of all, we recognize what an ambitious law the Global Fragility Act is, and how creating new ways of working within the US government is complicated. And it's been made all the more difficult by COVID-19 and new ways of working. When the report was delivered to Congress on September 15th, the Global Fragility Act Coalition reviewed it closely, and we responded factually through statements from various organizations and also in op-eds, pointing out the components of the law that were not included in that initial strategy. But at this point, we're hopeful that moving forward, each of those components can be addressed, the most important of which is identification of the priority countries and understanding what the rationale, what the basis was for selecting each of those countries, and that the law's commitment to including both countries where preventive action could have a great effect, as well as stabilization activities can be effective, making sure that there's a balance in the 5 countries selected would be important. And I think one other key aspect that we pointed out was the leadership component. And again, we would like to see the strategy designate senior leaders in each agency and at the White House who will be responsible for this. And we understand that undertaking such an ambitious new program of work will only be possible and can only be effective if senior leaders within the agencies are consistently messaging about its importance, asking the difficult questions, and making key decisions about the implementation process. So that's really something that we would like to see the global fragility strategy include. I'm confident that the US government has seen our statements, and they've certainly always been open to receiving recommendations. And the Global Fragility Act Coalition, intends to continue to partner closely with each of the agencies moving forward. We've had a wonderful partnership to date, and I have no doubt that that will continue in the next administration.
Yeah, I mean, just to point out, Richmond, our USG colleagues, both at State and Aid, we have, significant conversations with them, and they have been involved in the consultations as well throughout this process. We did have a question that came in that said, how can other NGOs get involved in the GFA coalition? Just reach out to AFP and Mercy Corps. Reach out to Richmond or myself. You are all welcome. There's over 65 organizations that are now part of it. We want to build the coalition. The work is not done. So a bunch of other questions coming in. Mark and Megan, how can Congress ensure successful implementation of the global fragility moving forward? What are some of the tools you all have?
Well, I'll kick it off because it dovetails well with where Richmond left off. We have a number of sort of forcing mechanisms that we can use, and we've been engaged robustly with the executive branch using some of those, and I think we need to decide how to sort of escalate over the next Congress to ensure that the legislation is implemented effectively if it starts slipping even more. I think we understand where some of the delays have come from, and our position right now has been we want the strategy done right. And in sort of these like unprecedented times, if that means the schedule slips a little bit, we have been sort of forgiving on that. But what I think we're not willing to compromise on is the effectiveness of the implementation, because there isn't really a good excuse for that. And I think where some of the concerns are emerging are around sort of an unequal level of buy-in across the executive branch and within the State Department. There are really exceptional people engaged in trying to implement this, implement the Global Fragility Act. But there are also places where people aren't stepping up and doing their jobs. And I think one of the real problems, just as a quick example, is when missions overseas or regional bureaus are not sort of fully engaging in how to implement the strategy ends up being implemented in response to a reality of where we are currently engaged and we currently have a diplomatic presence and there are currently perceived as opportunities. And really, if you're doing planning right, you're supposed to be looking at where there could be opportunities and could be engagement and letting those facts dictate the reality of where we are. And that's backwards right now. And I think that that's a fault line that's starting to emerge in the implementation that's really very concerning. And so the tools that we have to answer your question more directly is, I think, conducting congressional hearings is really important. Following up across authorizers and appropriators to make sure that the resources are put in the right place, and then our most effective tool is following up with subsequent legislation to be far more prescriptive if we need to. And I think that that's the thing that the executive branch should realize is on the table, that we gave latitude to the executive branch to decide how to implement this, given that it was a really bold new proposal that had a lot of things that need to be figured out. But if it's not being done in an effective way, then we can always be more prescriptive.
Megan? Thank you, Mark. That was excellent. Megan?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. I guess I'll just piggyback of what Mark was saying about making sure all the different bureaus and agencies are really engaged, and that's challenging. And, these are big entities, all of them. And we've certainly seen kind of some pieces of the different agencies be more involved than others. And that's something that we've continued to drive home, or try to, at least in our consultations at a staff level, that this really does require senior leadership and from many different entities within these different departments and agencies. And I guess piggybacking off of Mark's point about letting we were very broad in what to consider when choosing priority and focus countries. There was a lot in there that they could look at, different metrics, different, factors, et cetera. And we really wanted the kind of methodology and the research base to provide an option and a wide range of countries to choose from. But, that is being measured against embassies' capacity and staffing to be able to implement the requirements of the GFA, which is, we'll fully admit, a big undertaking of reporting and coordination, et cetera. But unfortunately, many places where, I would argue this might be most relevant is places that is hardest to operate, where we don't have significant resourcing. And instead of rethinking the resourcing and staffing and our presence, rather than saying, thinking about that, rather than saying, well, this place is ineligible because they're not capable of carrying out the GFA. And I don't pretend to have all the answers there. I just think it's an important thing to consider about making sure we're letting the data and the facts drive where our focus are, rather than our capacity in some instances. And I will let, much more intelligent and qualified individuals throw that back and forth. But I guess I would just throw that out there for a conversation about implementation going forward.
Okay, thank you so much, Megan. That's great. Okay, so we have a couple of questions that are targeted at people. Kareem, you mentioned the local peace building, local actors. Can you give a couple of recommendations that came out from those reports?
Sure. I'm actually scrolling down because I put them in the comment. But Susanna Campbell of American University wrote a chapter on this, and she's written quite a bit about this and is very thoughtful. But 3 of her recommendations, and I actually have a 4th, one is that the country plans should outline a learning process and not just be kind of a plan setting out U.S. objectives, but what will be the process for the USG to learn through the implementation of the plan. Second, where possible, use locally derived indicators of progress on the ground. Third, include in the reports back to Congress, which I think are biennial, a description of how U.S. programs were modified over time. Not just impact, but what did the USG do to respond to conditions on the ground? And there's a couple of others in the report.
Okay, and just to make sure, the report is out now. Can you say where it is?
Yeah, I actually shared the link in the chat.
So, yeah. Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure people could find it. Okay, so another question that's come in is around different sectors, education, health sectors. This can't just be business as usual. They have to be part of the prevention strategy. How is that going to happen? And so Richmond and Kareem, I know you've done a lot of work on this. Your thoughts?
Well, all along, we've made the point that for the GFA to be successful, the U.S. government will need to put together basket of different diplomatic and programmatic activities depending on the context or that specific environment. That's why research and learning has to be at the heart of this initiative, because part of the exercise is determining the approaches and the multi-sectoral approaches, how these different thematic issues or entry points for intervention can come together and work effectively together. It's also why Mark highlighted earlier why Congress wasn't more prescriptive in specifying exactly which activities they wanted implemented in each country. Because instead what Congress wanted was the US government to develop a research and learning process by which it could look at a country, look over the horizon, identify where there were potential risks, consult with local communities in those countries and at the subnational level, and identify what are the types of programmatic initiatives that would be most successful in that specific place. And so in some places, education might be at the heart of the challenges if, for instance, there were an environment with lack of access to education. And in other environments, there might be a series of environment or climate resilience types of activities. And in other places, it will be about justice sector reform and rule of law. So I think to a certain degree, this is again why it depends on which priority countries are selected. But our hope, beyond lifting up any one type of programmatic area, is rather that the US government would really adopt this type of evidence-based approach where they will take into account the local conditions, including consultations with those local communities to determine what the appropriate balance, what the appropriate basket of activities is.
So I agree with that, Liz. The only additional point I would make is that I think another reason that it's really important to have flexibility in terms of programs and sectors is that you also want to be sure that whatever you're investing in is what the local communities want and what the local leaders want, and that we're not imposing what we think needs to happen from the outside. So we have 2 chapters, which I'm not going to go through. I know I've cited the report a lot, but I just want to flag them because they address this in the report. One by Amy Potter-Czechowski on ensuring local ownership from the inside out, which describes a program in Sierra Leone that the organization that she works with, Catalyst for Peace, led from the bottom up. And it's really interesting. And then there's another article by Marieke Schomeres, who's at Overseas Development Institute in the UK, and is leading the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium over there. And she has an article about how policymakers' biases often have too much impact on the kinds of programs that are selected and the problems with that. And so I think we need to be very careful that we're actually following what is needed in the context versus imposing what we think for all the right reasons, but what we think is needed. And so that flexibility is really important for that reason.
Jonathan, you wanted to jump in here?
Yes, thank you. I think this was one of the issues that has come up quite a lot, actually, in terms of the potential of human capital analysis to drive better informed approaches to prevention. We have tried to look at this from a risk and resilience point of view, and I think risk and resilience approaches to prevention. And I think the resilience side of this is really where you see the education, the health, also the social cohesion aspects of it. And again, COVID has shown us really clearly how this can play out in a very quick fire way in terms of how the impact has spread. So you've seen how social protection initiatives have responded to the crisis in different ways. But in another way, we've also seen in terms of, you know, if you're looking at why particular development issues or development initiatives succeed or fail, often it's the underlying human capital elements, that the degree to which they are attended to in the design process. Now, is the educational system geared sufficiently to maintain the kind of reforms that are being imposed across governments or within different institutions? And quite often those elements get left out, and people wonder why they're not getting the impact that they had hoped for. So we're very much seeing that. Part of our response to that is we're building in a human capital dimension to the OECD's fragility framework, which of course is directly linked to the Act. So we hope that will add and facilitate that conversation about how human capital factors impact on those kind of preventative actions.
Okay, thank you. And I also want to say one of my favorite reports that I think really gets at this issue is from Mercy Corps, and it was an education program that they had worked on in Somalia, and it showed that education wasn't enough. You had to do education plus civic work, and what else had to happen in this education program to show that it actually reduced violence. Or reduced people wanting to go towards violent extremist groups. So I really, it's one of my favorite reports, and it shows how the education sector can work. Also, one other really quick problem is that, and I understand this, other sectors are like, we don't, first of all, the peace building and conflict prevention community has to show us or has to help us with these indicators. In terms of, because otherwise you're putting a whole nother level on us of what we have to measure. So that pops into a measurement question. How are we going to measure the GFA? And I know there's a lot of work that's been done on that. And then Jonathan, another question back to you that really focuses on, again, we talk about the multilateral engagements and the coordination. Can you give us some examples of where it's actually happened and where it's worked well? So first, the M&E piece. Anyone want to take it on? Kareem, anyone? I mean, this is such a critical piece, and this is one thing that AFP and I know Mercy Corps pushed really hard to make sure that this was in the Act.
I mean, I can give some thoughts to kick it off from what Congress is going to do for. It's not one thing. The legislation spells out indicators to measure against for overall success in a country. Are we increasing, making progress against indicators for fragility and violence within a country? And that's the big picture, right? Like that's the outcome that we're trying to achieve. But within that, because the GFA isn't one thing, it's really looking at the whole of U.S. government and multilateral engagement in a country to the extent the U.S. government can influence that through a multilateral fund or other efforts through diplomacy, and racking and stacking that engagement to try to look towards achieving that ultimate outcome of reducing the indicators of fragility or violence, and then measuring each one of those inputs, whether it's education programming, what's the outcome from that education programming, or governance programming, or corruption reduction, or security sector assistance, and then specifically measuring whether or not we are achieving more granular outcomes, and then whether or not those granular outcomes are achieving or sort of bending the curve on the overall engagement. So it's not that it's one thing; it's looking across all of our programming to see whether or not they're moving towards a common goal.
Thanks, Mark. Anyone else on the M&E question? I mean, this really is, I think, the critical question. And one of the things I'll just say, one of the things that I want people to take a look at is looking at a congressional research report on the Northern Triangle. And this is what I have talked to people about looking forward, is that the Obama-Biden administration was doing the GFA before it was the GFA in the Northern Triangle. And they were doing a lot of evidence work showing that where programs were running in those areas, they showed a decline. They were able to reduce violence. They were also showing that there was less migration north in the areas that they were implementing these programs. So it's possible. We just haven't done a good job at it. And, you know, Mercy Corps, I always say this, Mercy Corps is really leading on evidence in this field. It's possible. We've shown we can do it. However, the resources have to be there. The donors have to demand it. And the implementing organizations also have to step up and do it. So I think that's a really critical piece of it, and a learning platform that I know the U.S. government is putting together right now.
Let me make one more small point.
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I think one of my concerns in this is that everyone involved in from the program planning to funding to implementation has an incentive to say that the program worked. And I think we have a feedback loop of telling ourselves that it's all okay and that what we're doing works fine. And I think one of the things that Congress has tried to emphasize in this legislation is that we really want to hear those lessons learned where things didn't work. And I think from implementers to donors, I think it's okay to come to Congress and say, this effort didn't work, but here's what we learned from it. And I think that's one of the things that I'm really hoping to see more from this is lessons learned from things that didn't work, because I think that shows where we're really challenging ourselves.
Mark, I think
sorry, go ahead, Richmond.
Just to say, Mark, I think that's an excellent idea. It's one of the reasons why the coalition has really been advocating for a learning and research network to be launched by the U.S. government, that you can't ask the same implementers to always do the research themselves, and that it will also take new types of research and inviting new actors to partner with the U.S. government in this endeavor. And I think that's the only way that you're going to really be able to change the way that we're currently monitoring and evaluating.
Thanks, Richmond. Okay, so over to you, Jonathan. Okay, we talked about this from a 30,000-foot level, that we have to be coordinated. Do you have some examples of where it's happened, or how can we do this better?
I mean, definitely there are examples out there where we have seen it come together. If you go back over 20, 30 years ago, if you look at the organizational structure that was put in place in 1999 for the intervention in Kosovo, you can certainly see all pillars of the Nexus represented in there. That has stood the test of time over a period of 30 years. You look at the Department of Defense, there's still a US base in Kosovo, which has a certain political impact by virtue of just being in there. There's obviously a development aspect to it. There are and an ongoing political peace building process on top of that. That is a 30-year process. I think on other ways you have, I think one of the more recent and interesting examples is Bougainville. And you look at a peace agreement that was signed in 2001, a commitment to a long-term peace building approach, overlaid with a very clear development cooperation and economic support plan, very clear leadership, and in this case from Australia, New Zealand and the UNDP, who took a leadership role in that instance, but also getting at some of the points that have been raised in the questions, a conscious effort to build social cohesion matched with an investment in building technical support and capacity. Looking at rule of law issues by bringing in a regional police mission, a conscious effort again to engage civil society, and again and a very active education program. So we can see there layer upon layer upon layer. By no means a finished process, but a commitment over a 20-year period to bring a process to a certain point. And I think there is one I think fact that's worth acknowledging in all of this, and that there has to be a really serious conversation around what capacity is out there to tap into, not just within the US structures, but with your multilateral partners. All member states, looking at the DAC, all member states are stressed right now. They're all dealing with COVID, and that which has impacted on them in various different ways. They're coming collectively, DAC members are coming from a very low basis of investment in prevention, just 4% in 2018 of DAC support ODA to prevention activities. So the baseline here is quite low. And I think then coming into some of the M&E and implementation aspects of it, some of the crunch factors here will be, where can efficiencies be achieved at local levels? Can country platforms or similar type structures be introduced around which you can achieve efficiencies and division of labor and that burden sharing that's talked about in the report, but at a multilateral level, to achieve the kind of ambitions that are outlined in the report. And one other point I would make within that, and it gets back to the point about inclusivity, and you mentioned Susanna Campbell earlier on, is the willingness for the local voice to be part of that M&E process. Particularly important in contested situations where there will be a divergence about what priorities should be. And the willingness then of multilateral partners, including the US, to how far are you going to go with your accountability in that situation? How much trust are you going to impart to local structures to perform that role and to feed into that M&E process? So, I think recognizing that voice as part of the M&E conversation will be equally important. But there are plenty of good examples to draw. Thank you.
So thank you, Jonathan. I was part of the UNMIC mission in Kosovo, and we learned a lot of lessons for those of us who had been in Bosnia, and we spent a lot of time. Unfortunately, a lot of those lessons get lost from each mission to the next. Okay, we have time for 2 last questions. So I'm gonna, on that local point you just brought up, Jonathan, there's a concern out there that, we'll bureaucrat this and we'll get lost this really significant local aspect that we want to make sure is highlighted in this process. Okay, so how do we make sure that it's really focused on the locally owned? And then really important question that we haven't gotten to is the reporting, the biennial reporting to Congress. What do you want to see out of that, Mark and Megan? And how do you make sure that it gets delivered? So really quickly on the local, we've had consultations. AFP and Peace Direct actually did consultations virtually, and there's a lot of reports that have come out of it, but Kareem, Richmond, or Jonathan, any others want to comment on the local?
Yeah, I mean, just one thought is we were just talking about monitoring and evaluation and indicators. That can be used as an opportunity to bring in local stakeholders and to get their ownership of the process if you involve them in the development of these indicators. So it's not just a technical process, but it's actually part of the political process of mitigating fragility.
Okay.
Yeah, I completely.
There's lots of reports out there. Richmond, you want to comment, or Jonathan?
Sorry, I completely agree with that, and I think there has to be conscious effort to build that in at the earliest possible stage. I think that certainly some of these case studies we've looked at, it's still the case more often than not that communities in fragile contexts are being asked to own something that is not of their making. And I think building them in from the design, building that local element in from the design phase is a critical element to getting meaningful local ownership, and also recognizing that ownership has to extend to leadership, and that has to be factored into the design process as well.
Yeah, Richmond, anything, or are you?
Just to say that it's also an opportunity to address the concern that Mark mentioned earlier, which is a disconnect between Washington and U.S. Missions internationally. Really putting local communities at the heart of this will require the type of frontline diplomatic engagement that I think that the framers of the GFA really wanted to see, to assess and understand the root causes of conflict and to propose the types of activities that would be most effective. Will take a significant amount of frontline engagement. We're not always used to seeing that because of security constraints in so many environments, but if it is able to push the US government in the direction of having more engagement with local communities and in parts of countries where we are typically not present, I think that would go a long way in addressing the concern that Mark articulated earlier.
Yeah, I would really ask people to look at the reports that came out of those consultations. Also, Peace Direct funding is a really big issue. And how do you actually fund? It means the US government has to take risk. Okay, so Mark and Megan, I want to get back to you. These reports that are supposed to be coming through, what do you want to see in them? How do you make sure that the GFA is being implemented?
Okay, I can start off. I don't want to. Meg, if you have thoughts, feel free to jump in. But the biennial reports tried to specify, or did specify, 4 very specific things that we were going to be looking at. We were going to be looking at the steps taken to implement the programming, the funding that was used, the total sum of funding that was actually obligated towards implementing the GFA, which is, I think, helps us see how the executive branch is viewing GFA implementation and whether it's sort of narrow or broad, and how much they're really putting resources into the implementation. And then the progress made towards achieving specific metrics and indicators on as defined in the Act, and then changes, as Kareem said, one of the key things to look at is what changes are being made in response to the monitoring and evaluations, and how are we learning from them? And so that's something that we specifically called out also. And so in addition to those sort of 4 broad categories, we shouldn't have to mandate that the executive branch, statutorily mandate that the executive branch come and brief, but we put a specific call out that they have to come and talk to us when directed to do so, because sometimes they drag their feet on that. And I think the goal here is to be able to get out in front of problems early and to not have to go back and forth about whether or not they have to come and be accountable to us.
The only thing I'll add to that is, as Mark mentioned before on the monitoring and evaluation piece, to me, those reports really need to show where things are working and where things aren't, and have a level of honesty that I don't think is necessarily common and sometimes in reports to Congress, right? I think there's a tendency to say, it's all going great, look at all these good things we've done. And, I think we've been pretty candid in our consultations previously of we want to have a honest conversation of where things aren't working and how do we stop and pivot and adapt. And you're right, have a tolerance of failure and allow that to happen and be part of the process. I mean, the other thing that I think will be a challenge going forward is, this requires member level commitment to continue to push for this and require, the administration to take this seriously. And this is a long time horizon for an authorization. This is not a short turnaround project. And so, obviously with Chairman Engel retiring and others, it is going to be a challenge. And I think that's something that we have to think about of how do we bring new champions into this? There's a certain level of buy-in that comes from being your bill and, your baby to see through the process. With a 10-year time horizon, the folks that are the players here will change, and we have good champions in appropriations and otherwise, but just thinking about how do we make sure every 2 years going forward there's folks that are in staff positions and member level commitment to make sure that this is successful.
All right, I just want to thank you all so much. And as you can, I hope you can tell, this is a lot of work. And I have to say, working with Richmond, Kareem, Mark, Megan, it is, I have to say, some of my favorite people just to absolutely work with. And, we've gone through so much together in the last few years, and we all still like each other. So that's good. But join us. Please join us. The coalition isn't done. I also want to say one other thing. Megan, AFP's amazing senior policy associate, has been behind the scenes helping get all your questions to me. So I want to thank her as well. And I want to thank this great panel, especially Jonathan. Thank you for joining us and pulling out that really important piece on the multilateralism and the international cooperation. So thank you so much. More work to be done. Join us. Bye.